Should I worry about anything? Hi, this is Bill Wright. Today on the Mini Bible College, we'll look at a man who worried about the wrong things, worked for the wrong things, built the wrong things, and believe it or not, was considered to be the wisest man who ever lived. How's that? Yes, our study through the Old Testament today takes us to the book of Ecclesiastes and the life of Solomon. Let's join Dick Woodward now for the message, Swan Song of Solomon.
The second poetry book that has been written by Solomon is the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes means the preacher, and the book of Ecclesiastes really is a sermon. It's a sermon that was preached by Solomon to the young men of Israel when he was an old man. And like Psalm 127, Ecclesiastes is a swan song of Solomon. Remember in Psalm 127, Solomon said, it's possible to be concerned or to worry in vain. It's possible to work very hard in vain. It's possible to build in vain, because it's possible to be worried or concerned. It's possible to work and it's possible to build the wrong things. Now, that was a swan song sermon from Solomon, because that was a commentary upon his life. He did apparently concern himself about the wrong things. He worked very hard for the wrong things, and he built the wrong things in his own opinion. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes is an expanded version of that swan song sermon of Solomon. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is saying to the young men of Israel, I tried to find the purpose and meaning of life. I tried to find the purpose and meaning of life in three areas. First of all, I sought the purpose and the meaning of life in material riches. I gave myself to accumulating wealth, and I became the wealthiest man who ever lived. Nobody ever succeeded in searching for the meaning and purpose of life in riches like Solomon did. But Solomon says to the young men of Israel, if you follow his argument through the book of Ecclesiastes, I faced my riches, my wealth, with the practical issue of my death. One day I saw a fool in the marketplace, and I asked myself, what's going to happen to that fool? He's going to die. Well, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to die. And who's going to spend all this wealth that I've accumulated? Maybe a fool like him. Solomon's son was a fool, and apparently he was thinking about that when he came to this conclusion. Well, when Solomon, after becoming the wealthiest man who ever lived, faced his wealth with the issue of his death, he said, this simply cannot be the purpose and the meaning of life. That cannot be what life is all about. He spells it out in his writings. He says, I'm disgusted about this, that I must leave the fruits of all my hard work to others. And who can tell whether my son will be a wise man or a fool? Yet I will have to give it all to him. How discouraging. So I turned to despair, he says, over this. Now, when he realized that riches were not the purpose and meaning of life, he says, he gave himself to know wisdom. And again, Solomon could say to the young men of Israel, I became the wisest man who ever lived. Now, he did. Now, Solomon didn't find the purpose and meaning of life in riches, and he didn't find it in wisdom either. He didn't find it in riches because he decided he couldn't take it with him, and he didn't find it in wisdom because he discovered that wisdom didn't lead to happiness. Have you ever seen the statue of the thinker? The thinker is not particularly the image of a happy person. You know, the thinker looks very glum. And Solomon came to this conclusion. He said, in much wisdom there's much sorrow, and he that increases knowledge increases grief. So a PhD isn't necessarily going to give you happiness, or a postdoctoral program, or going on and on becoming wise. That isn't necessarily going to make you happy. The psychologists have an expression. The expression is bovine contentment. You know, canine is pertaining to dogs. Bovine pertains to cattle. When I was in college and I had a question mark for a brain, I asked one of my professors questions to the point where one day he looked at me and he said, Dick, let me tell you what I think you ought to do. I was majoring in psychology. I still haven't gotten over that. But at the time I was having a hard time with it. And he said, I want you to do something for me. He said, I want you to go out into the country, and when you see some cattle, you get out of your car and go over there to one of those cows, and you get right up in front of that cow and look that cow right in the face. Look her right in the eye. And you'll just feel yourself relaxing all over when you look into the eyes of that cow, because that cow is content. They even have her picture on the can of milk. You know, it's a picture, a symbol of contentment. They call that bovine contentment, contentment that's based upon ignorance. She doesn't know that that grass she's munching has got strontium-90 on it. It's probably going to give her cancer. And she doesn't know that the world's divided into two camps that can destroy each other a couple of hundred times without even blinking. She doesn't know any of that, so she's content. So go out there and look into the eyes of a cow and relax. Well, when I thought that over, I decided, you know, that I sure needed to relax, but I didn't want to be a cow, and I didn't want to be contented because I was ignorant. I didn't want my contentment to be based upon ignorance. But see, here is a fact of life. When you get to the place where you know a great deal, is that going to make you happy? Is happiness really linked to knowledge? No, it isn't. We said in our introduction to the Bible that knowledge is not virtue, it's the application of knowledge that is virtue. Knowledge isn't wisdom, it's the application of knowledge that is wisdom. And knowledge isn't going to make you happy. It's the application of certain knowledge that can make you happy. Well, Solomon decided in his second quest for the purpose and meaning of life that again he was coming up empty, because wisdom did not necessarily lead him to happiness. Well, he tells the young men of Israel in his sermon called Ecclesiastes that he tried a third route in his search for the meaning and purpose of life. He gave himself to know folly and mirth and fun. What he means by that is he just went out and painted the town red every night. And he says to the young men of Israel, now remember, I was the wealthiest man who ever lived, and I was the smartest man who ever lived. Have you ever thought, when you look at people who are wealthy and you see some of the things that they have because they're wealthy, have you ever thought to yourself, boy, if I had that money, I could show them what to do with it. You know, it's a shame they have all that money because they don't ever seem to have any fun. But if I had that money, you know, I'm a lot smarter than they are. I would know what to do with those things. Well, see, Solomon said he had it all and he knew it all. And he gave himself to having fun. And he says, I did not withhold from my eyes anything they saw that they wanted. Boy, what a statement. Nobody ever painted the town redder than Solomon. But he said that while he was giving himself to know mirth and to know fun, he came up with this question: what good does it do? What use is it? What am I accomplishing? I've always been fascinated by the fact that the Kennedy brothers, Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, were given $1 million on their 21st birthday, and investors to invest it for them, and lawyers to, you know, find the tax loopholes and all that, so they would really, honest to goodness, have $1 million. Now, those men didn't have to work. They wouldn't have had to have worked a day in their life. And yet they both assumed responsibilities that cost them their lives. I believe people like the Kennedy brothers could tell us, because they've, you know, experienced riches, that riches are not where the purpose and meaning of life can be found. And people like them who didn't have to work could tell us, because most of us couldn't do this, we have to work. But people who could have spent their life on a yacht going to the Bahamas and, you know, going from one place to another and never working a day in their life, they could tell us, you weren't born to have fun. You weren't born just to paint the town red night after night. You see, Solomon discovered when he gave himself to having fun that he had deep down inside of him a sense of purpose. He knew he was here for a purpose, and the purpose for which God put him here was not just to have fun. That was his conclusion when he looked for the meaning of life in that area. Now, when he came to the end of his sermon to the young men of Israel, he said, do you want to hear the conclusion of the whole matter? And this was a conclusion that was based upon his search in those three areas for many, many years. Here's my final conclusion, he said. Fear God and obey His commandments, for this is the entire duty of man, for God will judge us for everything we do, including every hidden thing, good or bad. That was Solomon's great conclusion after that quest for the meaning and purpose of life in those three areas. Fear God, which means believe in God, and keep His commandments. The Hebrew puts it this way, for this will make you a whole man. That's what will make you the man that God planned for you to be. That's where you will find the meaning and purpose of life. That's where you will find fulfillment. That was the message Solomon shared with those young men of Israel. The second part of his conclusion was there's going to be a judgment. He says a lot of things in the Ecclesiastes about the injustices of life. There are many unjust things in life. And Solomon concludes that there has to be a judgment because that's the only way you can explain all this injustice in the world. There has to be a judgment someday. And so that's the twofold conclusion to which he comes. Now, essentially, that's the sermon he preached to these young men. But in giving them that sermon, he told them many, many things more than that. For instance, as you go through the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll see kind of a two-track system of truth. There are times when he's doubting, when he's questioning, when he's challenging everything, and he seems to be thinking apart from a revelation of God. Now, this is why this book is the favorite book of unbelievers and skeptics. They've always loved the book of Ecclesiastes because in this book, God permits Solomon to express all those doubts he had. He was a very brilliant man, and he questioned and he doubted. He had a question mark for a brain, and he was very pessimistic, almost to the point of being a defeatist philosophically. Now, there are many passages in Ecclesiastes that are like that. But then when he searches and God gives him a revelation, he gives us a lot of beautiful nuggets of truth. This is better than the book of Proverbs when it comes to statements of wisdom that you find in the book of Ecclesiastes. Because of these two tracks of truth here, some people even suggest that this book has more than one author. But really, if you understand what's happening in the book, it's like those discourses of Bildad and Zophar and Eliphaz in the book of Job. You know, some of the things they said, God said were not true, but they're recorded in the sacred record. Well, there are things like that in the book of Ecclesiastes that Solomon will say when he's pessimistic, when he's cynical, and when he's searching for the purpose and meaning of life. But as he finds his answers, you get some beautiful things. For instance, here's a beautiful one, and I'd like to look at some of these inspired preachments here. There's a time for everything, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to harvest, a time to kill, and a time to heal. This is chapter 3, a very, very beautiful passage in which he says that there is God's time for everything. I think in addition to illustrating here the little phrase in Psalm 1, his fruit in his season, or God's work in God's time, this is also saying that it's not either or, it's both and. A lot of times people will ask you questions and they're putting you on the horns of the old dilemma, is it either or? And the answer so often is it's not either this or that, it's both this and that. It's not either or, it's both and. I think that's what he's saying there in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. In chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, he says, God has planted eternity in the hearts of men. That's a beautiful thought. That's why men ask questions like Job asked, if a man die, shall he live again? Now, when he's a little bit cynical, he observes this. He says, I have observed another piece of foolishness in the earth. There is the case of the man who is quite alone, without a son or brother, yet he works hard to keep gaining more riches. And to whom will he leave it all? And why is he giving up so much now? It's all so pointless and depressing. This is an interesting observation. The workaholic, his children are grown, perhaps he's even single, and he works 18 to 20 hours a day, making more and more money, and he doesn't have anyone to whom to leave it, nobody who really needs it. Very often men are workaholics, and if you ask them about their workaholic schedule, they'll say, well, I've got to support my family, and right away they're off the hook. You know, after all, we've got to provide. Now, they know in their heart of hearts that that's not the only reason they work as hard as they do. They don't just work to provide for their families. They work for a lot of reasons. Now, it becomes obvious when the man doesn't have anybody to support, and he still works like that he isn't working just because people need the income that he brings in. In Genesis 3, remember when God approached man, and this is like it was and like it is, we said, and he asked man, where are you? Man says, I'm hiding. Now, there are many ways that men hide. They eat too much, they sleep too much, they play too much, and perhaps they work too much. Working too much could be a form of hiding from God. And I think that's what Solomon is uncovering here. In chapter 4, he gives us a beautiful insight into marriage when he says, two can accomplish more than twice as much as one, for the results can be much better. If one falls, the other pulls him up. But if a man falls when he's alone, he's in trouble. Woe to the man who is alone. Also, on a cold night, two under the same blanket gain warmth from each other. But how can one be warm alone? And one standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two can stand back to back and conquer. And three's even better. And a triple braided cord is not easily broken. Here's a beautiful expression. Anybody knows that a cable with 3 strands is a very strong cable, or a rope with 3 strands is a strong rope. Now Solomon's describing the marriage relationship here when he says, when God designed the relationship of marriage, He meant for human beings to have more of a relationship than animals have. When animals come together and procreate, they just come together. And they don't become one in mind or spirit. They just have a coming together, and they conjugate, and they procreate. But when God designed marriage, and He designed the relationship between a man and a woman, God meant that they should become one in spirit. That's the first strand in that rope, that 3-braided rope. And then He meant that they should be one in mind, that they should have communication. And then He meant that their physical union should be an expression of those deeper ties. And the idea is this: if your marriage is a 3-fold cord, if you have a spiritual tie, if you have an intellectual tie, and a physical expression of those spiritual ties, then if the physical relationship perhaps breaks down because of illness, or perhaps because of age or whatever, well, you've still got 2/3 of a marriage. The trouble with many marriages is they're all physical, and if something happens to the physical, there isn't anything to hold the people together. Remember this: God meant that we should have communion. He meant that we should have communication. And the physical relationship, someone has said it's 10% of the relationship if it's what it ought to be. And if it isn't what it ought to be, it's 90% of the problem. Well, it can be 90% of the problem, but it's really not the whole relationship. It's really the vehicle of expression through which the deeper ties in that relationship are expressed. I think that's a beautiful thought that comes from Solomon. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. In chapter 7, he gives us a great teaching. It sounds like a miniature book of Job. It's better to spend your time at funerals than at festivals, for you are going to die, and it is a good thing to think about while there is still time. Sorrow is better than laughter, for sadness has a refining influence on us. Yes, a wise man thinks much of death, while a fool thinks only of having a good time now. In the day of prosperity rejoice, but in the day of adversity know this, that God has made the one as well as the other. You see, what Solomon is saying is something that every pastor knows. There is a time when a pastor really has the attention of his congregation, and that's at a funeral. Because at a funeral, usually the value system of people is in alignment with God's value system. People are thinking about eternity. People are thinking about the next dimension and the reality of the next dimension, and the fact that the next dimension is the dimension that's really important. They're thinking about these things at a funeral. Because at a funeral, everybody identifies with the deceased, and they know that one day that's going to happen to them. There's no question about the fact that each of us is going to die. The only variables are when, where, how, and for what, but we're all going to die, and we know that when we go to a funeral. Now, God is interested in our values aligning with His values, and that's why He says through Solomon, it's better to go to a funeral than to a festival. You get more spiritual mileage out of a funeral than you get out of a party. And a wise man thinks much of death. That doesn't mean he's morbid and has a morbid death wish, but he just takes into account the fact that he's not going to be here forever. In chapter 7, we also have this good advice. Don't long for the good old days, for you don't know whether they were better than these. Say not the former days were better than these. The idea is we all have this kind of nostalgia, and we fantasize as we look back. When you think of your deceased parents, you have a tendency to remember their good points, even to the point of fantasizing them and making them better than they really were, and you don't remember their faults. We do this about much of the past. We think back, and it's always those were the good old days. Well, really, if you think back realistically, those days weren't all that good. The press secretary for President Reagan, who was shot, was interviewed, and he's been terribly handicapped by his accident there. There was a time when he was running the press conferences, and the interviewer asked him if he watched the news, and he and his wife said that the one thing that's kept them going is they don't look back, they don't think back, they don't talk back, and they don't go back. The Apostle Paul tells us there's a time when it is much wisdom to implement this principle, forgetting the things that are behind. There are times when you must forget the past, forget the things that are behind. It'll just tear you up to think back. And those good old days weren't so good, Solomon says. He tells us in chapter 7 also, don't be too good or too wise. Now that sounds like strange advice. The King James says, be not righteous overmuch. And what he means by that is, if you get to the place, especially where you think you're so righteous, you look down on the people who look down on people. You're like that Pharisee that says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men are. And then if you give the impression to your children that you're that righteous, you become an unrealistic model because you become an unattainable model. So don't take the stance that you're righteous overmuch, because he says there is not a single man in all the earth who is always good and never sins. So why should you give people the impression that you're that kind of a person? Now, chapter 9, there's a very familiar passage from Ecclesiastes. He says, again, I looked throughout the earth and saw that the swiftest person does not always win the race, nor the strongest man the battle, and that the wise men are often poor, and skillful men are not necessarily famous. But it is all by chance, by happening to be at the right place at the right time. Now, I wouldn't agree with that chance business, but I think what he's saying is a good observation, and this illustrates the biblical word grace or charisma. Again, humanism says the I am leads to the I can. You can do it. You've got what it takes to do it. And the Scripture consistently says, no, the He is leads to the you can. It's because God is, and it's because God can, and He's in you and with you. That's why you can. And because of that concept, which is referred to as the grace of God, it's true that the swiftest person doesn't always win the race, nor the strongest of the battle. Not the real race and not the real battle. In chapter 9, he says that there was a city that was saved through the advice of a wise man, but nobody ever remembered the wise man, and he was never appreciated. And he says that this was a terrible thing. But I think the truth that emerges from that little passage is, it's more important to get the job done than to get credit for getting the job done. F.B. Meyer, a very godly man in England, said that he had a crisis in his life and ministry, and someone asked him what the crisis was, and he said, well, let's put it this way. He said, before the crisis, I was a man who wanted to see Christ come to London through F.B. Meyer. And after the crisis, I was just a man who wanted to see Christ come to London. There's a big difference, and I think that's what he's suggesting in that little parable there. In chapter 10, he says, a dull axe requires great strength. Be wise and sharpen the blade. Some people go through life chopping with a dull axe. It reminds me of the phrase from the hymn, oh, what needless pain we bear, because we never take time to sharpen the axe. That's a real plug for education, of course. And then he says, never curse the king, not even in your thoughts, nor the rich man either, for a little bird will tell him what you've said. That's where we get the expression, a little birdie told me. Somebody has paraphrased it this way, what Solomon's getting at here in chapter 10, verse 20. You are the master of the unspoken word. The spoken word is master of you. So don't speak that word that you don't think should be spoken. In chapter 11, you have this beautiful thought. Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it again. Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Whoever looks at the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the path of the wind or how the body's formed in a mother's womb, so you cannot understand the work of God, the maker of all things. So sow your seed in the morning, and at evening let not your hands be idle, for you do not know which will succeed, whether this or that, or whether both will do equally well. This is a beautiful teaching for people who work with young people. If you're a Sunday school teacher and you teach young people, if you're a youth worker and work with young people, or if you have young people in your home, it's so important to realize this truth. When you work with young people, the fruit comes later. I think it's especially true of the junior high school age. Junior high school is a very difficult age to work with. Have you ever noticed this? If you really are helping them, they would never give you the impression you're helping them. If you say something that's really good, it's like a conspiracy. They decide they're not going to laugh at your jokes and they're not going to act like they appreciate what you're saying. That's just the mentality. But that doesn't mean you're not helping them. What this is saying, I think, applies especially to young people. Cast your bread upon the waters. You don't know what seed's going to prosper and what seed isn't going to prosper. It's the work of God. So just sow your seed all the time, and God will make it prosper. Have you ever seen very unlikely young people, after about 10 years, end up in seminary or the ministry or on the mission field? and you remember when they were a discipline problem in the youth group or in the Sunday school class and you just can't believe it, well, you just keep sowing that seed because the Holy Spirit can cause that seed to take root. I have yet to meet a teenager who shows less promise than I did as a teenager, and this may be why I feel very strongly with this. People who taught me things in Sunday school when I was there as a very small child, I'm sure had to have the gift of faith and just keep sowing the seed. When I go to my hometown, I never even tell people I'm a minister because I don't want to spend a half an hour trying to convince them that I'm not joking. You know, they still don't believe it. So that's a beautiful thing. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes ends with this beautiful passage. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth before the days of trouble come. You see, this is the message, really, Solomon is preaching to these young men. It's wonderful to be young man, he says. Enjoy every minute of it. But then he says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And here we have some beautiful poetry. It's a description of old age when all the body parts break down. He says, remember your Creator before the days of trouble come. When the keepers of the house tremble, that would be the arms and the hands, and the strong men stoop, that would be the legs. When the grinders cease because they're few, that would be the teeth. When those looking through the windows grow dim, that would be the eyes. When the doors to the street are closed, that would be the ears, and the sound of the grinding fades, and the songs grow faint, the ears are failing. When the almond tree blossoms, that's the white hair. And then, of course, when you get right down to it, before the silver cord is severed, you see Solomon's almost there. He's a very old man when he preaches this great sermon, and this must have been a very emotional conclusion to that sermon. Before the silver cord is severed, or the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, or the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. That's a great message to young men, isn't it? Here is this old man, Solomon, richest man who ever lived, wisest man who ever lived, the man who had more fun than any man who ever lived, the man who had more wives than any man who ever lived. 700 wives, 300 concubines. Here he is, getting up there, Mr. Experience himself. And he's saying to these young men, listen, experience is not the only teacher, it's just the most convincing teacher. It's convinced me, let it convince you. Let my experience convince you. And remember your Creator in the days of your youth. I sought for the meaning of life in riches, and it's not there. I sought for the meaning of life in wisdom, and it's not there. And I sought for the meaning of life in pleasure, and it's not there. Here's where it is. Fear God and keep His commandments, because this will make you a whole man. And do that when you're young.
Wow, godly advice from Solomon, Mr. Experience himself. And he sums it all up in that last section that Dick shared. Experience has convinced me. Let my experience convince you. I sought meaning to life in so many things, riches, wisdom, pleasure, and didn't find it anywhere. I looked to God and found it. Well, that wraps up another day of fine teaching with Pastor Dick Woodward. And I hope you've been blessed by the presence of the Lord today as you've listened. And if you enjoyed today's program, I hope you'll join us again next time as Pastor Dick takes us once again into a new lesson as he continues teaching us through the Bible. Thank you, and may God bless you until we meet again.